Victoria, and today is the 2nd of April, 1984. Today I'm interviewing DuMoulin, who's had experience in several provinces across Canada. This is the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project, a project of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. And in order to begin, I wonder if you might tell us when and where you were born, and a little bit about your early life.
Yes, well, I sort of consider myself to be a composite Canadian because I was born in Kingston, Ontario, which, as you know, was a lovely historic old spot, and stayed there till that was in the early 1920s, and stayed there till I was 11, at which point my parents moved back to British Columbia to Vancouver, where I took my education and had my first two jobs, and subsequently went to Manitoba. So that's why I consider myself to be, central and prairie and western, so I feel very comfortable in Canada, generally.
Where were you during the Depression?
I wasn't born.
Well, that certainly answers that question.
I mean, I was really too young. Let's say I was in the land of the living, Karen, but I was not really old enough to be fully aware as a afterwards social worker to know the effects on people at that point.
And when the war broke out, were you here in British Columbia?
Yes, I was unfortunately here when we were doing it to the Japanese at that point.
Did you have a consciousness of what was happening to the Japanese with the internment and that sort of thing?
Not so much actually when it happened, but my first job after I graduated from UBC in social work was in the Kitsilano area of Vancouver, in a neighborhood house there, and this was an area where the Japanese had lived and had been evacuated from, and war workers from all over Canada had come to man the various industries that were making baby flat tops and all other kinds of war effort of that nature. And they came with their children, and both mom and dad were usually working, and the poor kids were absolutely rootless and familyless, and so our job was to try and give them some kind of feeling of home or belonging. And so that was the time when it finally struck me that something very horrendous and major had happened that when I was going to school at the university hadn't really occurred to me, the kind of human loss and anguish that was going to come of that move.
When was it that you were at the School of Social Work at UBC?
In the 40s. In those days, because of the war, they gave you what was called an accelerated course, which meant that you took it in 3 years with 2 summer schools and a block placement of 3.5 months, which coincidentally took place in Victoria. 4 of us went from Vancouver over here, and we were the first people who would hit Victoria as social work students, so I think it was sort of a mutual shock situation, but subsequently it turned out that a number of students had gone to the various communities in BC to take field work. But this was in the early 40s. I got my bachelor's in 45, I think, Bachelor of Social Work degree. You got a BA first in those days, and then had a year of postgraduate, and then later on in 47 I went back and was in the first class of masters at UBC, first class.
What kind of courses did you have when you were doing your BA in social work? Do you have a recollection about that?
Well, it was the standard, I guess, understanding human behavior and economics, which was, unfortunately in those days we mostly had, apart from say 2 or 3 core instructors that were social work professionals, we sort of shopped for courses in other faculties like economics and sociology, and I think we even had various visiting psychiatrists who came once a week and tried to explain mental illness to us. So it was a little not quite as well integrated an educational experience as we hope for today. So it was the standard issue of understanding human behavior and of course the history of social work, which is part of this project you're engaged in now.
There were some interesting professors that I think were on campus around that time. I'm trying to remember who.
Well, Leonard Marsh was one of the well-known ones that was the author of the Marsh Report, if you'll remember. And he, poor dear, he's now no longer in the land of the living, had to try and teach us statistics and research. And if you imagine trying to teach research and statistics to a first-year University School of Social Work graduate who's green as grass, for a man of his eminence, it must have been a sore trial to him, and I know it was certainly a sore trial to us.
When you were in school, was that the time that he was doing the Marsh Report?
Well, prior to that.
Did you have any sense that he had done this important document?
Oh yes, we realized that he was, well, in those days I guess he would pass as a celebrity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any stories that go along with being in his classes?
No, I think the general overriding thing is more anguish than anything else. As I say, it's not exactly the kind of beginning thing that we now consider that you'd feed a social worker from day one, or at least a would-be social worker from day one.
Mm-hmm.
But Marjorie Smith was a grand old gal of social work. She was the director in those days. She was an American lady that had worked in public welfare and came up and started the School of Social Work. It had been done as shoestring, sort of visiting professor who were doing it out of the goodness of their heart kind of thing. But then in the early 40s, they systematized it and gave a baccalaureate.
Mm-hmm.
And subsequently, as I said, went on in 47 to give the first, I think it was, if not the first course in Canada, the second in Canada, UBC, master's course.
Why had you decided to go into social work, Anne?
Well, not for any very altruistic reasons, mainly because I've been very interested as a volunteer for the Girl Guides Movement Association for many years, and various other voluntary jobs, and somewhere along about third year university it suddenly dawned on me that I could get paid for doing something which I had done for the sheer enjoyment for many, many years. And this seemed to be, fortuitous in the extreme and wonderful to be able to, and of course in those days you earned the magnificent sum of $1,390 a year, and so that seemed to me to be a lot better than zero. And so that's really how I got into social work, and of course my line has been group work and community organization ever since, so I've never been in the counseling, individual one-to-one part of social work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this was a very natural lead-in, and subsequently I've enjoyed everything I've done just as much as I have my volunteer work, which I still continue.
Uh-huh. You mentioned that you did one of your field placements here in Victoria. What agency or organization did you work?
It was the Children's Aid. This was before all the voluntary agencies in BC were sort of met their demise, and the Children's Aid had the usual services, and I remember two of our group of four were in the Jubilee Hospital Social Service Department, and two of us were working in the Children's Aid, and it was again the procedure of throwing you off the end of the wharf into the nice deep water and you flounder around in those days. I mean, it was really in those days field work was a apprenticeship system. I mean, you had a supervisor, and the supervisor kind of gave you the key to the washroom and told you how many forms to make out to get an agency car, and assigned you some cases, and you sort of sank or swam in those days. And being in child welfare protection was a nice demanding place to know whether you were going to swim or sink. Most of us managed to swim.
What were you doing?
Well, protection in the war. This was, as you know, a large naval center, and again, people dislocated from all across Canada, and women trying to cope on their own with husbands at sea or in training or overseas or something. And I would say that the bulk of the cases, I don't know what the selection process was in the agency, but the bulk of the cases that I got involved with were with service personnel, largely with single-parent women who were trying to cope with a great deal of pressure and were, as you might expect, living pretty dull and somewhat constricted lives, and took their pleasures where they could find them, with the kind of results in the children which was pretty fracturing and pretty upsetting to have, 6 or 7 different daddies every year in the home. So that was a baptism of fire, which we all went through, and I think after that, my practice in the Alexander House in this Kitsilano area I was telling you about, I felt much more comfortable and much more that I could contribute some skills than I did in the counseling situation.
When you were working at the neighborhood house,
Alexander Neighbourhood House, yes, second that.
What kind of thing were you doing there?
Well, I was hired to start a program for these children that I described to you, the ones that were living in the housing which had been vacated by the Japanese. And this was elementary school age, plus they had never had any programming for teenagers at that point, and this was the sort of vogue time for teen canteens, if you remember. That was maybe before your days, which were designed to let teenagers come together and play the jukebox and drink soft drinks and generally gather, as opposed to getting into all the other kinds of situations which were around in a war with a lot of strange people and dislocated people. So we tried to make our center a kind of home base for the people in the area. They had a full program of preschool and mothers groups and all that sort of thing, but my particular assignment was to develop a program for these kids, and this was on well, it started me off in a good way, in that it was not something you could do any way 9 to 5 or X evenings a week. You really had to try and have a situation where the kids could come whenever, and this included weekends and Christmases and that sort of thing. So it was a full plate.
Would you have been doing your work in the agency, or were you out and about? You know, I think of a concept in the 70s, I guess it was, with street workers.
No, we were not as bold as the street worker concept. This was a little bit before that. We certainly did home visiting to try and recruit, try and say that the services were there. We also did a lot of court appearances and this sort of thing, because many of the kids that we were trying to establish some kind of base with and some kind of relationship with did get into trouble with the law enforcement people one way or another, and so we often were because mom and daddy were working or were no longer together or something, we were usually the friend at court for many of these kids. So we did that type of thing, and then of course as part of programming we tried to take them away from just being in the center and explore some of the beauties and interesting things in their new home, their new neighborhood in Vancouver.
How did the kids respond to that kind of idea?
Well, I guess, it was the usual ups and downs, and however, I have one really nifty success story, I must admit. That one kid who was particularly belligerent and particularly tough, and we'll call him Frank, and Frank was the kind who would come in and put all kinds of firecrackers in the kitchen cupboards, and just generally wreak havoc. And we really tried with Frank. We had to go to the court several times to plead for him being given second chances, and also at school because he did the same kind of behavior. And you'll be now pleased to hear that he is the chief buyer for a very prominent Canadian, and since you don't need commercials on this particular project, a very prominent Canadian jewelry shop which has coast-to-coast service and shops, and he is their chief buyer and still looks us up when he's out in this neck of the woods, the boys worker that was there. So that's a nice success story, and I'm sure that had we managed to keep up with a lot of the other kids, we would have found out they found their feet too.
Were you dealing with a lot of kids?
Oh, I would think several hundred. In different groups.
So you were really kept busy then?
You could say so, yes.
At that time, were you having any involvement with the professional association?
Yes, that's when I first joined the professional association and was on there first, or if not first, the first committee I was on was the social action committee, which funnily enough is the one I'm still on in Victoria, some 40 to 80, that's quite a long time. It was, in those days, I think perhaps the schools did an even better job of drumming it in to students than they perhaps do today, that part of your obligation, if you want to be taken seriously as a professional person, is to not only join your professional association, but get in there and work collectively towards some of the goals that we believe in, and not just give lip service to. And this is a channel which sometimes, through your agency, is inhibits you or prevents you even from taking some of the action that you might want to change legislation and make known wrongs and various things like that. And so this was my first contact, and I've been active ever since those days.
What were some of the issues that you were working on in those mid-40s, I guess?
Well, it's hard to believe that there is quite a similarity, like adequate housing, like proper health care, which was very, very chancy and spotty in those days. That was one of our really significant things. In those days, too, we were very thrilled and optimistic because we were building, we thought, probably one of the best social legislation systems of anywhere in the world. We felt very avant-garde in BC, and I suppose this is one of the reasons why it is so doubly tragic and sad for us who were around in those hopeful, exciting days to see the system being dismantled piece by piece today, with terrible pain and grief to very many vulnerable groups in this province that we thought we'd isolated and helped design a system to support and make life worthwhile and make this a caring, intelligent province.
Thinking back to what you mentioned about being in class with Leonard Marsh, who, as much as any other Canadian or any Canadian at the time, had a vision of what a welfare state might look like. Had any of the inspiration that for the social action that was taking place in the social work community come through him or in relation to him?
Oh yes, I would think that in many sources. You know, I think there was a lot of ferment going on. I mean, after all, don't forget, everybody was being fed the line that this was the war that was going to achieve all the social justice and all the goals for everyone, and that we were opposing dictatorship and racism and evil, and that we were on the side of the angels and all these, and you know, I don't want to sound flip about this, because our friends, contemporaries, were being killed in large numbers and injured and maimed, so we took these kinds of value systems pretty seriously during wartime, and I think we were all convinced that what we were being told was that this was not necessarily the war to end all wars, but certainly the war to establish a code for human behavior which would not permit kind of things like the Holocaust and other dreadful things that we were hearing about in the press and in the media, and that we had, I think, a lot of optimism that a new social order would evolve, that we could all feel that the sacrifice that had been made, we certainly weren't making many sacrifices in those days in Canada, those of us who spent the war in Canada, but certainly our contemporaries were.
The ending of the war was so, well, from reading, in my contemporary times, was so dramatic. As a social worker at that time, what was the feeling in the social work community about the way the war ended?
I can't think of that as being a particularly vivid memory.
Just wondering. So you went to work for the neighborhood house, and then you went back to school to get your master's?
Yes.
Is that how that worked?
Yes. They were recruiting a group of, I think we ended up by being 11 people who had been in practice for a few years, but who had gone through a formal bachelor's program to at least have some basis to evolve a master's degree program from. And they managed to find various sources of income. I remember there was something called the Princess Alice leadership fund. This was Princess Alice, who was the wife of the Governor General of Canada, as you remember, the got loans. And because I was in group work, this was for people who were going to work in groups, and especially with young people, so I managed to get my hands on that particular scholarship. And each one of us had some kind of funding, because all of us had to leave jobs and go back for a full year to get this credential. So it was kind of fun, because everybody in the class had some kind of background that we could draw on, and I think it made the educational experience richer and more entertaining, and a little bit more interesting conflict and men and women. And so that was 47, and it was a very interesting time.
Who recruited you all?
Well, the school faculty who managed to get funding to introduce this program, and then realized that to give it a fair shake, they didn't want to just promote people right from the bachelor's degree who are still a little green in the whole thing, and it would probably test a master's program better to have people who hadn't been out for 100 years, you know, but who had been out at least in the School of Hard Knocks for a few years, so that they would bring something to the educational experience from their own experience.
How were the courses that you took then different from the courses that you'd had previously at the bachelor's level?
Well, I think one of the distinctions was, by this time, the full-time education faculty at the school had gone to, from the two I mentioned, I think, in the earlier thing, to about 3 or 4 people who were a nice core group, and they had by then started suggesting that it was important that the field component be more than simply an apprenticeship, and therefore the school was spending time with agency personnel to groom them as field supervisors and to support them and to have meetings and so on, so that it was gradually coalescing as not simply a sort of a bunch of academic courses strung together and then thrown out into the stream and sink or swim, to being an integrated kind of thing. And of course, because we were back in the master's degree and this acceleration was no longer a high priority, we did field placements in a continuum with the courses, which is, I think, a happier situation than taking all your academic stuff and then doing your practice. So they had evolved to that point where they could offer field experience with a supervisor who had had contact with what was being given in the course content and some kind of idea of the pacing of it, so that they could try to the limit of their capability at that time to make the learning that was being offered in the field relevant to the theory that was being taught in the classroom.
What field placements did you do during your master's?
I did my field work at the Gordon Neighbourhood House, which at that point was just evolving as being one of the early centers for senior citizens in Canada. Again, and this was another social phenomenon, that people who had lived in the prairies and had decided to retire very often were retiring to the west end of Vancouver and being very unprepared to dislocating themselves from their hometowns and villages on the prairies and other spots of Canada would mean to go and live in 1 room or 2 rooms in a rooming house in the West End and have no roots and no extended family support and so on. And so we had a lot of elderly people in that geographic area. The other thing we had were a large number of war brides who had come from various parts of the world, mainly from Great Britain, who had come back with their husbands, and some of the situations that they found themselves in were not exactly what they had been led to believe by their courting spouses, who I'm sure embroidered the greatness of Canadian life and the beauties of Vancouver beyond belief. So that part of our work there was to try and help these girls adjust to Canadian society and into Vancouver in particular. And so that the emphasis that I had in my field work was mainly in that area.
At that time, was the idea of, quote, social planning, end quote, something that was being discussed in school, coursework and things like that?
Yes. it was in pretty elementary stages, pretty rudimentary stages in those days. There were components in the fundraising, the old community chest movement of social planning, but it was more of what used to be called a council of social agencies, and it was a sort of an in-trade kind of planning. I don't think that the concept of broadly involving the community groups, labor management, educational forces, and others in the community had really gelled at that time. It was still the Council of Social Agencies concepts, where people who were already committed to delivering service in the field came together and tried to quote, quote, coordinate and cooperate, and the old objectives of eliminating waste and reinforcing effort and so on, so that it wasn't a very sophisticated concept in those days. And my particular work, of course, through all this stage was group work, was working with people in groups.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned that yourself and 10 others were recruited by the school to get the master's program off to a good start. Who were some of your fellow students at that time?
Well, we had quite a mixed bag. 2 of them are here now in Victoria. That's Ron and Elsa Hooper. Ron was the director of public welfare in Winnipeg for a number of years, and they have recently retired to Victoria. June Emmett, who was married to Alan Emmett, the mayor of, I guess Reeve they call it, of Burnaby for many years, and she's been in social work practice for a number of years, still living there. Several other people who I've really lost track of. I think nearly everybody did continue in practice. Some went to other countries to practice, and we haven't really kept, an old home week kind of thing, particularly I think because very shortly thereafter I moved to the prairies and was busy trying to establish my contacts there. But it was a very bright, stimulating group of people.
You got your master's degree in what, 1948, 49?
47.
47. And did you go directly to Winnipeg from there?
No, because of having done my practice work in Gordon House, I was offered the directorship of what they called Senior House. There were 2 units in the Gordon House Centre, one for juniors and teenagers and one for young adults and senior citizens. And so I was offered the directorship of that and to be a field supervisor for the school. So I spent the next 2.5 years in that job, and as I say, this was really fascinating because we were really pioneering the sort of lengths and breadths and methods and so on of working with elderly people. This is one of the pioneer efforts, and also with a lot of the, as I suggested, war wives and young people who were starting in professions and who had come from other parts of Canada for various reasons to live in Vancouver.
What inspires you to move away from the beautiful West?
Well, one of the reasons, though, I think, is that when you're young and sort of dauntless, in those days, you don't realize how, when someone phones you and says, we want to start a group work section at the School of Social Work at the University of Manitoba, and your name has been given to us as someone that might come and set it up for us and set up the field work placements in the course and so on. You don't sort of think, me, an educator at my age sort of thing. You think, well, that sounds pretty exciting and interesting. And so that was one of the reasons that tempted me, plus the fact I didn't know anybody in Manitoba and Winnipeg, and I suffered from a delightful situation where I have quite a large family, brothers who are very well known in the law profession in BC, and there's only one DuMoulin family with that are Huguenot French, not French Canadian, Quebec French, and so we are all kind of liable for each other's sins and achievements. And I guess I was getting a little fed up in Vancouver of being so-and-so's sister or so-and-so's daughter. And so I thought, well, wouldn't this be jolly to go into a place where I'm just going to either make it or break it on my own, and I can afford to go in without trailing behind me a whole list of either achievements or shortcomings. So that was one of the really intriguing things about going to a new province and a new school. Well, the school was about 12 years old, but they hadn't just had a casework sequence there up until then. That was the fall of 1949 when I started. Excuse me.
So what did you find when you arrived in Winnipeg?
Well, I found that there was only one other person in the province that had had anything to do with group work, so we had to really start from scratch. I mean, from the point of view of being a qualified, trained person. So we had to start from scratch, and it was quite a lively beginning because, as I mentioned, it was the fall of '49, and I was scrambling around trying to get a class together and then get field work placements for them, which meant that apart from this one gal who could supervise, that I also did the supervision as well as the teaching. So it was quite a lively year. It was topped only by the fact that in those days, when you were teaching at university, you had practically 4 months off in the summer where you were supposed to do scholarship and prepare yourself for teaching and so on. None of this business of just 1 month. So most of us got other kinds of assignments for the summer so we could learn something, and I tried to get myself and did an assignment with the then Social Planning Council of Winnipeg, and I was supposed to do a study of one of the districts in Winnipeg to see whether a neighborhood house similar to the ones I'd worked in would be an appropriate way to meet the needs of that particular district. And I was to come on board on, I think it was May the 1st, and on May the 3rd the dikes broke. Winnipeg famous 1950 flood, and the Social Planning Council was converted from a research and consultative thing to being in charge of all the volunteer effort in flood fighting, and in particular dealing with the refugees which streamed into Winnipeg from the various areas where they had to abandon their houses. So that was a really nifty first, on the ground kind of experience in community organization, because it was a disaster which was not quickly over with. It was a progressive kind of thing. It gave us a little bit more time to cope, but this was the time when I met one of my first greats, apart from Leonard Marsh, was Bessie Tuzel, who was then in the Ontario, practicing in Ontario, and the Canadian Red Cross sent her to Winnipeg to set up, to help the local branch set up services for flood victims and so on. And so it was a very stimulating experience working in the same milieu as Bessie and seeing how she went about it. And
what did you learn from her?
Well, I think learned something about the fact that if you are good at what you're doing, and if you have a good background, if you know how to relate to people, that you can be taken seriously, and you can have just as much impact as the brigadiers, who were very big in any kind of a disaster situation, or the army are in there like Finn. And here were a few of us some of us rather more mature than others, but ladies who were, I think, initially branded as sort of bleeding heart and practical types, actually being taken after a few days seriously because we were able to deliver the goods in terms of organization and approach, and being able to relate to a whole bunch of sorts and conditions and kind of sort out things for people who were under an awful lot of tension, because nobody at that point knew just how desperate the situation was going to be, going to become.
So what was your role in working with the volunteers then?
Well, the two of us manned what was then the council, also ran what was then called the Central Volunteer Bureau, which was also quite famous throughout Canada because it had set up during the World War II something called block system, which was taken from the WVS in Britain, which was that in all the blocks in town, a woman or a person at home was the block captain, and they reported to district captains and area captains and so on, and all through the war they did things like salvage and fundraising for the Red Cross and fundraising for various war projects and home hospitality for service personnel, all this sort of thing. And so they had a very well worked out organization, and it was administered from the Social Planning Council. So 2 of us were on 12-hour shifts for about 3 months that summer, supervising a bank of telephones to try and deploy volunteers to soup kitchens, sandbagging dikes, taking offers of housing for refugees, placing refugees in the housing, this sort of thing.
Who was it that you were working with?
Well, the director of the Social Planning Council was a woman called Mrs. McQueen. Mrs. Holdy McQueen, as she was called, and she was a very highly regarded, great pioneer in social work too. She was not a professional social worker herself, and she was the director, and she took herself over to the Army headquarters and sort of dealt with the Army, and left her 2 other younger staff members, myself, who was supposed to be the research lady, and my friend, who was now with me in Victoria, Mary Elizabeth Baird, who was the director of the Volunteer Bureau in those days. So the 2 of us took on 24-hour duty at this, and of course all the power was off and all the heat was off, and our offices were on the 4th floor, so I kind of wish that would happen again, not with all the misery of the flood, but having to run up and down 4 flights of stairs would do me a world of good today in the physical fitness department.
When the flood receded and the floodwaters receded, and it was time to go back to school, what happened then? You went back to the university?
Well, then things went relatively smoothly. We set up various services before the September term opened. We also went down, made a couple of calls in Minneapolis and other American communities to try and raise some money, because many of the Winnipeg refugees had gone down there. And that was interesting. That was my first really big experience in trying to fundraise for something. And when we went back to the school, it was, I think one of the most exciting things about that was that by this time, men were trickling back into the graduate level. This is service personnel who had the university grants opportunities, young men who had perhaps would not have gone to university without that kind of backing. And they were now reaching the School of Social Work level. So for the first time, instead of being predominantly female, the school's enrollment was getting to be almost 50-50. And for relatively young instructors such as myself in those days, it was quite a challenge for some of these hard-bitten World War II ex-soldiers who thought they'd really seen life and really been around, and what could some of these sweet little chits that were supposed to be teaching them something ever teach them. And so that was kind of a challenge and fun too, and you had to be really sure that you knew what you were talking about, because you were not dealing with innocent little kids that had come through the school system. You were dealing with people that had been really out there, both men and women who'd been out there, and if not in actual combat duty in war industry and that type of thing. And they were a really fairly mature, fairly inquiring, fairly you-gotta-show-me kind of people. And that was a marvelous spirit to have.
How did you deal with them?
Well, I think by showing them that we weren't all cream puffs either. One of my students at that time was Andy Thompson, who was subsequently the Liberal leader of Ontario, is now senator. He had been in the Canadian Navy, and most of the time in our supervision periods, Andy would like to talk about, try to back me into a corner to try to convince him that he should carry on with social work. And I can remember at one point saying, "Now look, Andy, I don't really care." I'm sure I said something a little more forceful than that. Whether you go on in social work or not, but you're on a scholarship which someone's paying for you to learn, and I'm on a salary and someone's paying me to teach, and by God, that's what we're going to do for the rest of the term. I don't want to hear anything more about whether you're going to stay in social work or not. Let's just learn it, and you learn it and I'll teach it. So we got along beautifully from then on in. But that was the caliber of person that we had, and it was kind of nifty, because there was no doubt that these people were serious and they wanted a serious career in their life. And they, again, to follow on what I said earlier about value system. They really wanted the world to turn out to be better for their efforts, and they saw this as a vehicle for doing just that.
As I remember, Manitoba, the university there was innovative in developing a concept of field instruction. Unit supervisors, I think is what it was called. Were you there at the time that's happening?
That was just after my time, when they actually had people put on faculty on the payroll of the school as opposed to on the payroll of the agency. Now, mind you, in lots of cases they did double duty, depending on the size of the unit. But that was a great step forward. That would have been about 54 or 55, I would guess, and by then I had been asked to go to the Social Planning Council as director to replace Mrs. McQueen that I mentioned earlier, and try to move the council from this council social agency concept to something which was more broadly based. And so that was another exciting thing to do, and again, being young and not knowing that I couldn't do it, I accepted. And we struggled along and changed our name as not really a very significant thing, but it was in the history of the evolving of the thing. Was we called ourselves a welfare council. That was the next step, and then we finally moved on to social planning council and that concept later down the road. But I spent 17 years as director of the planning council in Winnipeg, and of course, as Winnipeg is the only large urban center, many of the projects that we were involved with had all kinds of provincial-wide spin-off, and Winnipeg, as you know, is the center of government there. So although we were Winnipeg-based, you couldn't draw a line, and so our concerns, for example, with Indian and Métis and services for Indian Métis were the roots of the solutions to those problems were certainly not in the urban center, but were throughout the province, and so we had to be much more broad in our approach and in our recognizing of problems and looking for solutions than simply in the urban area.
When you started at the Social Planning Council, or it was first called the Council of Social Agencies when you went there, what did you hope to accomplish? Did you have some goals that you had set out?
Well, you know, they were the conventional goals, and that was that we had a sort of a what makes Topsy grow kind of a approach to setting up services, and that we were trying to get some order out of the chaos. Funding was getting increasingly hard. People will do things in a wartime. They will volunteer and they will make sacrifices and they will do fundraising projects, which when they get back to quote, quote, normal life, they lose some of that terrific enthusiasm and adrenaline that kept them going in a tense situation. And so we had to look for other approaches and to try and rationalize and make some sense to people that we really had a system that was accessible to the people who needed it most, and was operated in a way which people could, both government and voluntary funds, could support with some feeling of confidence that this wasn't just somebody's hobby horse or somebody's cause, but that really it could be rationalized and that there was some approach with other professions and other groups in the community that we wanted to make this community a sort of supportive place that people could work out their destiny in.
When you began work at the Council of Social Agencies, what was the involvement of provincial and city governments in social welfare? This was when, 53?
Middle 50s. Middle 50s. Well, of course, the department had a very well-developed service. At that point, they had a department of social welfare as distinct from health, which, you know, the argument can go on incessantly whether it's better to have health and welfare under one umbrella at the government level or not. At that point, they had a welfare department, which was the network throughout the province. We also had large voluntary agencies which were supported by the community chest, and the city of Winnipeg had its own public welfare department, health department. So it was a fairly well-developed system at that point, and again, some of the things that we all recognize that were certainly by no means unique to Manitoba, but were particularly pressing in the Winnipeg area, and this was the tremendous disproportion of casualties in our health and welfare system of people of Indian and Métis origin that were far out of proportion to their incidence in the population. And one of the early major thrusts that we tried for was to involve the Indian and Métis people themselves in some meaningful way in trying to find some of the solutions to some of the problems. And when you hear today some of the marvelous achievements that have been made, and how seriously all levels of government are now taking the situation of our Indigenous people, it really, you have to go back and say to everybody, don't give up. I mean, don't think you're going to see anything very much in 2 or 3 years. And for goodness sake, don't go into social planning, or what we used to call in those days community organization. That was the prior label to what we call now social planning. Don't go into community organization if you expect instant results, because you won't get them, and you'll get into all kinds of difficulties, and people will call you. I remember that we instituted in about, I guess, 57 or somewhere along there, the first what we called Indian Métis Conference in Manitoba, and we brought people in from the reserves and other communities, Indian Métis people, to sit down with people in the non-Indian community and try and establish what some of the problems were, and hopefully some of the solutions. And of course, the Indian people in those days had never been consulted on anything by anybody, and were totally unfamiliar with the kinds of structures that we would use in conferencing and meetings, and it was a very stop-and-go, spotty kind of effort. And one of our workers, who was one of my staff, who was particularly responsible for this, unfortunately, we had in the community at that time another person who has turned out to be a major star in Canada, who's now the primate of the Anglican Church, Ted Scott, who was the moderator of the World Council of Churches meeting that was held here last August. Well, Ted was just a common garden clergyman in those days, and but he was a person for the Anglican Church and the student Christian movement who was dealt particularly with the health and welfare field, so he knew us very well. And I can remember that this staff member was investigated, unbeknownst to us, by the RCMP, because we were labeled communist in those days, because we were consorting with Indians and suggesting that perhaps the status quo needed some questioning and perhaps even needed some change. Unfortunately, the RCMP consulted Ted Scott, who even in those days was a very persuasive, very impressive figure, and he cleared our copybook so that we were not put away by the RCMP for taking up the cause of some of our Indigenous people.
I understand that out of that conference there were some pretty significant results.
Well, we had them every year for a number of years, and gradually gave over the management of those conferences from the Welfare Planning Council to the Indian people themselves, and gradually diminished our role to being a participant. And I think a lot of good material came out of that, a lot of good proceedings. That were the first time people had really enunciated what some of these problems were, and how they might be attacked. And God knows we haven't solved them yet, but at least it got it on the front burner that this was the most urgent thing, both in the corrections system, in the child welfare system, in the health system. This was where far and away the largest majority of units of service were being directed to these people, and in a very sort of blind and uncomprehending way. And I think we have reached, although there's still a long way to go in many of our approaches to Indian people, at least I think that this was one of the early serious beginnings, and there was no question that the profession of social work, both the Manitoba Association of Social Work, which was then active, and the council, which was then mostly staffed by social workers, subsequently by an interdisciplinary group of staff, gave the focus and some of the background that created a situation where other groups like the Chamber of Commerce and the Trades and Labour Council started taking this thing seriously and recognizing it for what it was.
Okay, yeah, I wonder if that might be a place to take a little break.
Sure.
Stop for a minute? The timing of the thing. Oh, well, we're rolling with it at the beginning anyway. We're resuming our interview with Victoria today with Ann DuMoulin, and when we broke for our tea, we were discussing the Social Planning Council, or what was then known as the Council of Social Agencies. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about the Council of Social Agencies then was its role in relation to other agencies in the community. Was there any kind of a supervisory or controlling kind of role with the Council of Social
Well, not
Agencies?
directly. The structure we had in those days was that agencies applied to join and therefore agreed to certain specified objectives in our constitution, like attempts to coordinate, attempts to research needs, attempts to evaluate their own performance and so on, but there was no policing. The only way in which we got into the Policing Act slightly, or well, quite largely, was because we were always consultants to the budget allocation committees of the community chest, and had a close relationship with the Winnipeg Foundation, which was the other source of voluntary funds, so that when you're involved in the process of funding agencies, they tend to take your suggestions a little more seriously, although there was no legislative way we could say drop this or take on this. But there was a little power of suasion when you're acting as consultant to the funding groups. And as we evolved toward, now we're talking about early 70s, when we became Community Welfare Planning Council. All these names changes are funny, but they sort of signal periods in development. We then did something which I think is fairly unique in for a lot of Canadian communities. We put together something called the Joint Agency Budget Review Committee, and the joint was the provincial government, the City of Winnipeg, the Winnipeg Foundation, and the then United Way, which was a broader umbrella organization that succeeded the Community Chest, which was a more narrow one. And those partners met regularly with us from the Social Planning Council. We provided the secretariat for this group and went over all budget requests for funding from all agencies that applied to any of these partners. And this really, I think, was a huge step forward, because we could then, this wasn't from a point of view of policing, but even from a point of view of springing up more resources or different resources, or what was worth taking a gamble on, although we couldn't, because very often funding organizations, for their own reasons, have to be reluctant to put in seed money or risk money. And with all four partners being involved and knowing what was happening, then it gave a lovely supportive feeling to the fact that if everybody knew you were taking a flyer on this program and it flopped, well then it wasn't your terrible judgment. It was so this, I think, was a nifty development, and I think it's fairly infrequent in urban centers, and I would recommend it highly to people who are getting into practice to try and work towards some kind of we didn't always agree, and everybody, of course, could distribute their own funds the way they wished, but there was a sort of an attempt at some kind of a consensus and collaboration in the funding groups. Mm-hmm. And for example, when the voluntary funding groups would say, well, we'll underwrite the cost of this new thing for 3 years, well then this sort of lands the community with a service which eventually at the end of the 3 years is going to have to be picked up by some public agency grant or a new fundraising campaign. And so I think it made people take more seriously the initiation of new services and looking a little bit down the road as to how these bright ideas were either going to be killed, strangled, not at birth, but when they had disproved themselves, or were going to be maintained in some orderly fashion.
Did, in your view, did the close association with the community chest come united way have difficult negative consequences for the planning council?
Well, certainly we tried to make our consultation based, not an under-the-table kind of thing. I mean, the agencies knew exactly what our position was with regard to some of the new submissions they were making and so on, so that I don't think they saw us as tattling or unduly influencing funding. And I think the funding organization was very well served by our attempts, because instead of just looking at bits and pieces of agency budgets in every section of service, we would do a position paper. The Social Planning Council would do a position paper which the section who was dealing with child welfare services or health services or whatever would have, which put in perspective for them these little bits and pieces of budgets and agencies, so they could see that the overall trends which might make them want to talk to an agency about diminishing their service in one area and stepping up in another. In other words, there were more chips on the table and more people knew where you were at, and less games were played by virtue of someone knowing somebody or someone having their spouse or their child dying of X disease, and therefore putting emotional blackmail on everybody to give X disease hundreds of thousands of dollars. You know, they call themselves health agencies, but largely they're disease agencies.
During the time that you were the director of the Welfare Council and Welfare and Planning Council, there were a lot of developments in the field of social planning that took place. How did the agency keep up with all those changes?
Well, as we were in the central part of Canada and very isolated, you know, Manitoba is, there aren't a lot of other urban centres so that you have, for instance, in Ontario and Quebec, where you can have sort of cross-fertilization and people run into one another and therefore learn in that sort of slightly more slapdash fashion. We had to really try hard to make it possible for our volunteers and our staff people to get to conferences and workshops and institutes and seminars and really rehearse them in continuing education in the new learnings and new findings and new aspirations in the field. I think we were particularly, particularly sensitive to this because of our geographic isolation, which I think has great positives as well, because if you're really sensitive to the fact that you tend to be rather lonely and not getting buffeted by other trains of thought and wish to have that reversed, you may actually learn more and be more open than if you assume that because you're right in the middle of things, you're actually having some kind of a learning experience.
One of the things that's always fascinated me about social planning councils has been the relationship between the rational, the logical, the factual, and the political. Did you see an interplay between those factors in the time that you were at the social planning council?
Everything is political. I mean, there's no use having the most beautifully researched work document on correctional services if you haven't figured out a way to disseminate that, and if you haven't involved the people in the preparation of it that are going to be having to swallow whatever the results are and act on them. So persuasion, cajolery, pressure, power politics, everything is lobbying, everything is grist to social planning mill, in my view. I mean, short of outright criminal activity.
The, the, re- the relationship, though, between, say, power politics is one of the phrases that you use to describe how social planners get things done. What's the relationship of that to, quote, professional social work?
Well, I think perhaps this is one of my pet peeves with some of my colleagues in the past who have felt that everything to do with poverty and injury and pain and degradation is our territory, and anything to do with success and power and money and leadership is our natural enemy as social workers. And I have never found that to be the case. I have found that the community is made up of a variety of things, and while we I think in the past have seen ourselves as advocates for the downtrodden and the needy and so on and so on, that may have been a rather phony kind of thing too, that I'm not too sure that we were very good advocates or that we were very understanding. And we came from a different space mostly than a number of these people, and in order to change society or to help society want to change and suffer some of the pain that's involved in that, you have to be involved in places where decisions have to be made. And if you don't have credibility well, I'll give you a for instance being that we wanted to get some public housing in Manitoba. This was in the late 50s, around in there, yes. And there had been no public housing, and there had been a very strong position on the part of private enterprise and the Chamber of Commerce and so on that this was, again, the road to Bolshevism, if not worse. And so we finally had to work with the people we knew, and some of the people who had been on agency boards and our own board, and say, look, do us a favor. Don't take our word for it. Set up a committee in the Chamber of Commerce and look at what's happening in other provinces in Canada, and look at the fact that all this federal money is sitting out there, and we are getting this province is getting none of our fair share, and we're contributing our taxes, and we're not getting any payoff. And so how about you guys undertaking it? We'll service you. We'll give you a staff person to service this committee. And so this was the beginning, and lo and behold, the next thing we knew, after these men who were smart, sensible businessmen and could look at facts and could make the right deductions from them, brought in recommendations to the Manitoba and the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce that they should lead the way in the establishment of public housing. And we did get changes in the legislature, and we got a decent program of public housing underway, subsidized housing. And I'm not saying by any manner it means that we ever would make up to the full demand that kind of thing could be most beneficially used. At least we got through the logjam, which all the lecturing and preaching and gnashing and wailing of teeth, or is that the wrong way around? Anyway, would have convinced anybody. But by involving them and by saying, now, we think you're smart enough, or you wouldn't be where you are, that if you see the reality and you know what the resources are, and we can demonstrate to you the need, you draw your own conclusions about how to deal with this. And so this was a terrific breakthrough. Similarly, in the first Hall Commission, which led to Medicare, and that when they were going through Canada, listening to people talking about services that were needed and so on, we opted, instead of giving one more long erudite academic paper on the philosophy and so on, we combed agency files, and we found 12 cases of what we described as medical indigency, where people had been coping on a borderline income very nicely, thank you, for a number of years, and their kids had been okay and had gotten to the educational system, and then some horrible health reverse had hit them, and they became medically indigent, and their entire life savings were wiped out. People had to go to work and give up various career goals, and just devastation and mayhem took place. And I remember Wally McCutcheon, the late Senator McCutcheon, who was on that commission, saying afterwards, because these 12 cases that we gave, these were just 3-4 liners. So instead of having 10 pounds of material when they hit our brief, they had 3 typewritten pages or something like that. Apparently the commissioners were very impressed that here was a real nuts and bolts approach. Now this actually happened to these people, and for the job that Mr. So-and-so had, he couldn't make out without teeth, and there was no way they could get teeth. You know, just something as simple as that. And both Emmett Hall, who's still with us, thank goodness, and still as bright and so on as you always was very impressed with the fact that we were able to marshal these cases, describe them in simple terms, cause and effect, and just say, here is what we think people need, why they need to be protected, why they're not eligible for voluntary health insurance, and why we need a public health insurance scheme.
A couple of other issues on where it took place developed, and I think the Social Planning Council had something to do with them. One was the threatened closure of the School of Social Work at the university. Were you at the Social Planning Council then?
No, I was at the School of Social Work.
Oh, could we go back to that for a minute?
Sure. That was a beautiful case example. As a matter of fact, we did have it written up at the time, and I'm sure it's in somebody's archive somewhere, and I wish that I could give you the document right now, because it was a classic example of how a decision was made based on a lack of information, the wrong facts, a misapprehension of the total community scene, and how that action was reversed completely by the fact that the school, I think it was, if I remember, it was a Saturday, and I was downtown having lunch, and all was merry as the marriage bell when I left the campus on Friday, and on Saturday at lunch it came over the air that the University of Manitoba had done away with the School of Social Work for budget reasons. Well, that's kind of an interesting situation to be in, that you hear over the radio that your life's work is going down the drain. Anyway, a few of us decided that we didn't really want to take this lying down, and a few of us on the faculty, and so we started gathering up our friends and allies that we had made over the years in the community and in the political arena and other places, and made the case as to why the school was an important feature of our whole network of services to people. And I think we formed Save the School Committee and had everybody that we could possibly lay our hands on, and really did a good job of, in those days, community organization, to the point where the Board of Governors of the university, I think, were even afraid to go to cocktail parties in their usual country clubs, because somebody would come up to them and say, "No, Gifford, or whatever their name was, what on earth are you doing? This stupid move and doing the School of Social Work in." And whereas I think the assumption that the university had made was that this was probably the weakest, most vulnerable faculty, and the one that they could get rid of without much outcry, realized that they had gotten themselves a hornet's nest. And so the net result of about 2.5 months' work was that when the September term opened, the School of Social Work was not only reinstated, but had, in addition, a master's course added to what was a BSW course prior to then. So that was a very nifty turnaround, and a very good example of why you need to relate to the power structure in a community, and not just the have-nots, because certainly it was the power structure in this situation, as well as the clients and the students and potential students and others who rallied and said, too bad you don't realize what you've got here, but we're telling you that this is the significance. We also happen to have a very good ally in the Deputy Minister of Welfare at that time, the late K.O. McKenzie, who had been a graduate of the school, and helped us find our way through the maze of affecting a government which was the funding body for a university, but who could not appear to dictate to the university how it should spend its funds, because the principle of independence for universities had to be preserved. At the same time, we had to make the government so uncomfortable, they in turn had to make the university board somewhat uncomfortable about their discomfort, if you follow me, that rather Irish statement.
The intent is certainly clear. You were at the Social Planning Council for, what did you tell me?
17 years, yes.
What inspired you to leave, and where did you go?
Well, I think what inspired me to leave was that toward the end of those 17 years, we decided that what was really needed was a very comprehensive review of the service pattern that we had in the community and the needs pattern as best we could determine it. And so we instituted with other partners, the three other funding bodies and ourselves, a new entity called the Social Service Audit Incorporated, and we recruited community leaders not associated with any of those groups to be the board of the Social Service Audit, and we hired new independent staff to be the secretariat, and they undertook a 3-year study, a demographic study of the community and the surrounding province, and studies in depth of the various service fields, and brought in recommendations. And it seemed to me that in order to have the freedom to implement these recommendations, which made for a number of changes in the service delivery system and in the kinds of responsibilities for the social planning organization itself, that this would be the time to withdraw and let new management come in and have a fresh kick at the can, without being stuck with a whole lot of methods and values and systems that have been established over the years. And so that's when I decided that 17 years was enough. And I was fortunate enough to time it in such a way that both the continuing education division of the university and the School of Social Work had come to the conclusion that while the school was doing an excellent job of undergraduate and postgraduate training, that they had been woefully lacking in providing any educational sustenance for the practitioners in our own field of social work. And the continuing education department of the university were concerned about all the helping professions, and the fact that scarcely anything, with the exception of perhaps medicine and law, who were doing their own number within their professional associations, very few of them, nursing and physio, occupational and others, were doing a systematic kind of approach to continuing, evolving for practitioners. And so I was hired by a joint appointment with the School of Social Work and Continuing Education Division to go in and plan a program of part-time continuing education, and then in addition, certification for certain specialties that if people, after they've been in practice for umpteen years, decided that they really wanted, they had reviewed what was available in the field, and they really wanted to be super duper therapists, or they wanted to be community organizers, or whatever they wanted to be, that they could, while they were still maintaining themselves financially on the job, take a systematic course over a period of 1 or 2 years, night schools, summer schools, and so on, which would give them, in effect, a certificate in geriatrics or in recreation or whatever. And so I spent 9 years at that job, and then took early retirement and came to live in Lotus Land.
During that last job, the continuing education, what was the biggest challenge for you as that?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is always for educators, and certainly when you're dealing with mature students, which we were in continuing education, is to keep on touching base with the field to find out where they're at and where it's hurting, where the practitioners are feeling pain and inadequacy and ignorance and frustration and burnout and all those things, to out of the huge variety of offerings that you could present in a given year, to try and plug in to provide not just, should we say, faddy new approaches, which are very often presented in conferences and seminars and so on, and may have some merit and are at least refreshing to have a new thought, but may not address some of the really burning issues on the level of service delivery and service planning and service evaluation and funding evaluation. So a lot of the time of the continuing education person, in my view, should be spent with meeting with people in the field, individuals and groups, of the whole vast array of people in public and private practice and in the various categories of that practice, to ascertain where they're at and where it's hurting and where their curiosity lies. And at the same time, you have to keep in touch with the literature of what's going on in the field on the national and international level, to see where you can draw strength and wisdom in terms of hiring educators to come to your community and patch together offerings that are compatible with the needs of the people and the kind of resources you have. There's no use talking about very elaborate multidiscipline, huge child guidance clinics that are suitable in the Bronx or something for Portage Prairie in Manitoba. And so scale and complexity and all those things have to be ascertained. And you have to make opportunities for people who can take them and maintain their working situation. Often people cannot take a year off once they are responsible for a family budget or even for maintaining themselves to go back to school, because no one is going to keep the seat warm for you in our kind of field. As you get to be a more senior person, I mean, when you're more junior, it's relatively simpler to go back and take a master's or some other formal education because there are many more jobs. But as you get more senior, it becomes more perilous to give up your position. And those, of course, are the people who, if they're frozen in amber, can wreck your whole network of social services. So you have to arrange your educational opportunities in a way that bears in mind people's the realities of their situation, so they can plug into whatever you're offering.
Anna, I want to move now to a slightly different kind of involvement. I know that over a number of years you've been involved with the Canadian Association of Social Workers and the Manitoba Association. I'd love to hear about what you've done with the associations and what kinds of things that were going on over the years that you were involved with it.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I've been involved in the association since day one. I had the honor to be president of the Canadian Association in 1967-68, I think, which meant about a 6 or 8 year stint on the national board. And this was a very turbulent time in the history of the association, because we were just changing the balance from being a national association, which individuals joined directly as members, to being an association or federation, if you like, of provincial associations where persons joined the provincial, who in turn evolved a relationship with national. And the years just preceding my taking over as president, and during that, the period of my presidency, was when we were trying to hammer out with the newly established and vigorous provincial associations how this relationship was going to gel, and how a very small universe to raise money to maintain a national organization as well as a provincial one, understanding the realities of Canada, which is that our health and welfare system is delivered both through federal channels and provincial channels. So you need, if you're going to do any kind of a social planning or a standard setting or a standard implementing kind of effort on the behalf of the profession, you have to do it at least at both those two levels, and to some extent at the local municipal level as well. And Canada, in turn, should make some impact on the international social welfare system, and you need a national group to carry those colors into the world situation. So that was rather a fabulous period, because, as I say, for some of the more wealthy professions, enormous fees and multi-leveled professional stratas and colleges and institutes and all kinds of things are feasible. We are not as yet comparable in our earning capacity as some of the other more established professions, and so we had to be very careful in husbanding the resources of both the men and women power in terms of the volunteers that will work in a professional association and the dollars. So this was a kind of a major, the other kind of exciting thing, and I assume it's so much far gone that there are no legal implications, but this was the first time that the Code of Ethics of the Canadian Association had been tested by the Canadian Board deciding to cancel the membership of a member for unethical behavior. And the National Board, on recommendation of one of its provincial associations, decided to take this step. And the person whose membership we cancelled had a great fondness for litigation of all sorts with everyone that could possibly be on the other side of a court case. And we found ourselves, the Canadian Association of Social Workers and the executive director at that time, Florence Philpott, and myself as president, on the receiving end of a $3 million suit for defamation of character.
Maybe we could stop here for a minute. Could you turn off for a minute? So during that time, the Canadian Association had to come face to face with the application of the Code of Ethics through this court challenge. How was it resolved?
Well, I think one of the things that I think we're supposed to be good at as social workers is knowing our own limitations and knowing community resources. So as soon as we realized the seriousness of the situation that we were getting into, we retained a very excellent legal firm who coached us on what our correct interpretation of our own constitution and bylaws and ethical code and so on. So we recognized our limitations that as social workers we were not legal experts, and so we were able to retain a legal firm, and the net result of their efforts and our efforts was that the case was dismissed as being without merit some 2 years after it was first started.
I want to continue on with the discussion about the National Association, but I guess I want to sort of diverge for a moment onto the idea of registration, standards, licensing, and that kind of thing. Those kinds of questions arise for me out of that particular situation in the Code of Ethics. What are your thoughts about licensing social workers and a legislative mandate for the practice of social work?
Well, it's been a goal for so long, I think, of certainly the professional associations at the provincial level, because that's where the legislation would have to take place. The control is exerted there, and I don't think any province, perhaps Quebec is the one that would feel that they had achieved perhaps not everything they wished, but probably the most significant attempt to control. I don't think we can feel by any stretch of the imagination that we can in fact guarantee because someone is a registered social worker or an MSW or a doctor, that we can guarantee their practice as being totally competent and never and always above reproach. I'm afraid we're still in the situation where we're really relying on the schools to winnow out unsuitable people in the first instance, and then to try and in their graduates achieve, they're the only people that are really measuring by some kind of standard. It varies, and I don't know how precise you can be people's competence at that level. Certainly the association has been trying since year one to we've had funds and spent efforts to test competence, and I think it's salutary to know that we're still trying, and I think it's a very worthwhile goal, because people that come to us in our practice, not communities so much, but in the one-to-one, one-to-group, are people who are very vulnerable and who perhaps haven't got criteria where they can apply. It's perhaps easier for someone to know if their leg has not been set properly and they therefore are in extreme pain or immobilized than it is for them to realize whether or not they might have made a success of their marriage had they been given different support or different emphasis or different criteria to judge their own situation with. So when you ask me, do I attach a great deal of importance to it? I do. if you asked me when it was going to come all together and be in place, I would hate to try and predict, but it's certainly a goal which I think we should continue to strive for.
Moving back again into other issues that the professional association was involved with during the time that you were so active in it, what other things are going on?
Well, I think that we were really mainly absorbed in the two issues that I've mentioned. One, the resolution of a new structure and new funding for the professional association in the establishment of provincial associations and their relationship to national, and how that would work and how that could be funded, and also to test the fact that we had an ethical code which we were willing to stand behind and test. And those were the two major, I would say, areas of concern and considerable achievement.
Indeed, indeed. I'd like to move now to some general questions that are sort of moving us toward a conclusion. I'm wondering if, as you think back over the years that you've been in practice, what, both as an educator, as a social planner, and a group worker in Neighbourhood House, the changes that you've seen that have affected the profession, what are the big things that have happened to the profession over the years in your view?
Well, I don't know how you could isolate the forces in the community that have borne upon the profession in particular. I mean, the forces that's borne on the entire universe, such as the stepping up of communications, the changing of people's expectations as to what they think they deserve or merit or should merit in life, the terrible fracturing of some of our more stable institutions like the family and like the business place. Some of the change which the fractures were most welcome. I mean, changing roles, sexual roles, or gender roles would be better. Sexual has another connotation, I guess. But the new roles that men and women are assuming, that the roles in parenting that are now fully accepted, which, I mean, in my day, when I started out in practice, unmarried mothers, the best they could hope for was to perhaps end up getting a job being somebody's maid in another community so they could leave their hometown and no one would know their terrible secret, and they could have board and lodging until they delivered their baby and put it out for adoption. Well, now the faculties of universities are deciding, many of the women are deciding that parenting a child is part of their human experience that they want to have, not necessarily with a husband in the picture. And provisions such as maternity leave and so on are equally open to those people. And so whole new lifestyles and new values are impinging not just on our profession, but on the whole of society. And I don't know whether you could isolate anything that would, I mean, we were considered 40 years ago as bleeding hearts and do-gooders and all those things, and you know, we still are. We still have taken on a lot of battles and won a good few against injustice, and in the legislative field and in service delivery field. I guess as a profession we have certainly improved our formal education. I think we are much more aware of the educational goals that we hope for our students. I think we also perhaps are getting more adept at interrelationships with other professions, so for the benefit of the people we are supposed to be working on behalf of or with. As a profession, I guess we haven't been as bad or as immobilized or as fearful of change as some other professions, because that's our stock and trade, is to affect change or to help affect change in individuals, in groups, in society. Mind you, I'm sure we have our fair share of people that have been just immobilized and burned out by the tremendous demands for rethink and reevaluation on all our concepts, not our values, but our techniques, our approaches and our theories. But I think we have an advantage in that that was our stock and trade. And we never thought we could manipulate the world, or that we could manipulate society, or that we were God. In fact, hopefully that was trained out of us on day one or early on. And so therefore, we haven't had the feeling of regret and remorse that I think maybe professions like perhaps the clergy and medicine and some others who really did think that they were arbiters of values and standards and are now confronted with the fact that a lot of people disagree with them. It probably was a strength, the social work, to have it built in that we never had that assumption in the first place, and so it wasn't so hard for us to lose it.
As you think back over your career, Anne, an opportunity to talk there.
Correct.
As you think back over your career, I'm wondering if there are accomplishments of which you're particularly proud or pleased.
You mean personal or?
In your role as a professional social worker.
Well, I think I can't, think of something I want engraved on my tombstone. Partly because I don't plan to have a tombstone. Because I really don't think that my career or my entity needs to be marked in that particular way. But I do think that I have had access to a lot of decision-making levels in Canada and provincially in the two provinces that I've worked in. And I think that I certainly feel no regrets about having chosen this as the way I would like to be engaged in life in Canada, and where I would like to put the main thrust. And it's given me, I think, the entree to a number of other very interesting volunteer associations of various kinds, not just in social work, but in the arts and in international organizations and learning in various other fields that have some of my learning in social work, I think, has made it easier for me to penetrate some of the mazes in other systems in Canada and enjoy my connections with the arts and with other voluntary organizations and the church. And I think that probably being a standard carrier for the profession on the provincial and national level is something I'm proud of, because I have never felt that the source of font of all wisdom was Ontario and Quebec for social work or any other system. And the fact that being a little nobody from Manitoba, that we were able to participate fully in the professional life of this profession in Canada and internationally has been, I think, a very nice feeling and a very reassuring feeling that systems are open if you know how to get at them and if you really care to do it.
Have there been some things that have been particularly meaningful for you to call yourself a social worker?
I'm not quite sure how you're coming at that question.
Sorry, I'm not being as clear as I should be. You partly answered it to a certain extent already, I think, but what has it meant to you to be able to call yourself a professional social worker?
Well, let's say I'd rather think that at my main thrust of how I spent my working career was at a task which I think is more valuable to society perhaps than being a roulette dealer or nothing against used car salesmen or various other ways in which you might have taken your time. I feel that, in retrospect, I think there's been more significance in what I've been able to achieve, and also I feel good about it because I think that the things that we were standing for 40 years ago are every bit as relevant, and when we see setbacks and turnabouts and realize that the new generation of people who are coming into practice are going to have to, they certainly are not going to have any easier road than we did, and they're going to have some very tough fights ahead of them on all fronts. So I guess the nicest part and the significant, the meaningful part is that you felt that you were in an arena which really mattered, and that you had some techniques and theories and values that helped you have a clear-cut role to play in that, and you weren't having to compromise your beliefs and values to accommodate other forces which were antagonistic to your values, that you could stand up and fight for them, and that people kind of expected it of you, and they might not like you for it, and you might lose friends or colleagues in that fashion, but that they could see that it was a legitimate position to take, that confrontation and other techniques are perfectly legitimate, and that everything is not compromise and conciliation.
I'm nearly at the end here, but I'm struck with the mention that you made so frequently during our conversation here of values. Are those values something that you can articulate for us in some way?
Well, you know, it sounds so oversimplified. You know, I'm not writing a primer for some new social workers or something like that, but I guess what I mean by values is that if you're not convinced that human beings have a dignity and a right to be treated in a dignified fashion and with consideration, and if you don't have a conviction that given some opportunities, I don't mean people with gross disabilities of one sort or another, but people with some growth potential, that given a situation that they will be able to grow and develop and be able to manage their own affairs and other people's affairs and whatever role they're called upon in society, that they can be assisted to do that better, and that, you know, that we, contrary to what I learned as a child in the catechism, that we should be thankful to be called to this class, that the dear Lord, I've forgotten the precise quote, but we should be content with the role that dear God has called us to in life. Well, you see, we don't really believe that. We believe that we have a potential, and so does everybody else. And social work, if you will, the values that we believed in firmly and that Jane Addams believed in and all the old great pioneers are now being discovered by all kinds of other people. We are now having all kinds of allies out in the field taking up various social justice issues like multiculturalism and anti-evil and pro-good and all the things that for a long time we felt we were the only people that were really fighting for those values. And now I think that some of those fundamental things are now recognized and are being fought for in a very significant way on the global scene as well as the local and Canada-wide.
And I wonder if in closing there's anything that you'd like to add?
I think the only thing I could add is that learning from the past is a useful exercise. Certainly it beats trial and error. We'll always be in the trial and error business, but I think that a project like this could be of immense use if it's used in a creative fashion. And of course, one of my hobbies is reading. One of the things I love best, and I love reading history and stuff like that. So maybe I'm predisposed to thinking that we old dinosaurs might be able to not act as role models, but to let young people know that we were there, And we had our lumps and our successes, and we hope nothing better or worse for them.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I would like to thank you very much for spending time with us this afternoon. It's been a fascinating experience for me to talk to someone who was in social planning in the years past, and I very much appreciated your participation.
Thank you for finding room on the shelves in the archives.
Thanks very much.